Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Deuteronomy. Compared to the other 5 books of the Torah, Deuteronomy is a confusing book. Genesis is a story. Exodus and Numbers, they largely continue that story. Leviticus, as we've discussed in a previous teaching, is a departure from the story, but it also gives us the legal ramifications of living together with God in the midst of the tabernacle. But what about Deuteronomy? I've mentioned before that Deuteronomy is Moshe's speech, his rousing and inspiring dialogue before the children enter the promised land. Except in a few weeks, we will see in Parsha Shoftim that it is anything but a speech. Instead, we will hear law after law. Appoint judges for yourselves. You must do justice by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, no less. Set up cities of refuge for the accidental murderer, the Ara Miklat, and don't move the boundary marker of your neighbor's property. What is this long list of laws doing in the middle of this book that is supposedly Moshe's inspirational speech? These laws aren't confined to Parsha Shoftim either. This list of laws actually begin in the previous Parsha, Re'ah. Re'ah talks about destroying Avodah Zarah, which literally means strange worship, meaning foreign worship, idolatry, or worshiping deities other than the God of Israel. It speaks of God's special place and the Levite in the laws of meat and blood. And they don't end in Parsha Shoftim either. They keep going through Parshas Ki Tetzei and Ki Tavo. In fact, of the 34 chapters of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26 are all a bunch of laws, no speech at all. That's 14 out of 34 chapters in the book of Deuteronomy. The sages pick up on this for the name of the book, Mishnah Torah, which means second law, or Deuteronomy in fancy English, because the book has an enormous legal section. So which is it? Is it a speech, or is it a book of laws? And how do we read this slightly boring legal section as a whole instead of take a look at this random law or here's another random law? Let's try and bring these laws to life. This week, let's focus on trying to make sense of this long list of laws in the middle of Deuteronomy. Right before this giant legal section, we hear Moses describe a strange ritual. In chapter 11, Moshe says, "Behold, I set before you on this day a blessing and a curse." God gives you the blessing if you follow the commandments, and he curses you if you stray from the path that he has set before you. Okay, so we have the conditions for the blessing and the curse, but what is the actual blessing? Do we all merit long life? Maybe everyone gets a lifetime supply of Ahava Dead Sea skin products. Seemingly, the text does not say. Instead, it continues to say, when you get to the land, you do this ritual, where you give the blessings on these mountains, and the text even tells us where these mountains are. Across the Jordan, toward the setting of the sun in Canaan, across from Gilgal, near Elonei Morah, but not a trace of what the blessing or curse actually is. Now, when I read these verses, I felt like I could have sworn I had heard this somewhere before. The ritual where a nation stands at Har Gerizim, or Hall of All, something about someone standing in the valley and reading a list of blessings, and people say amen, and a list of curses, and again, people say amen. And I'm pretty sure that there was a whole list of what these blessings and curses actually are. But I felt kind of crazy because none of that is present in our text, except the most vague description of this ritual. But wouldn't you know, much later in Deuteronomy, all the way in chapter 27, Moshe starts to describe this blessing and cursing event and goes into all of the details. These are the tribes that will bless the people on Mount Gerizim, and these are the tribes that will stand for the curse on Mount Ebal. And the Levites will proclaim, Cursed are those who curse their father and mother. And the people will answer, Amen. And the text goes on to list all the things that you will be cursed for and all the terrible things that will happen to you and all the wonderful blessings and good things that will happen to you. So what's going on here? Why are we repeating this event? Why doesn't the Torah put the in-depth description of the blessings and curses in chapter 11 way back when it started talking about it? But what if the Torah isn't actually repeating this event about the blessings and the curses? What if Moses begins with the description back in chapter 11 and ends his description in chapter 27? And what happens in the middle isn't a giant departure. It's all part of the same very long story. So let me show you what I mean. In chapter 11, when Moses first describes how the blessings will come to those who keep the laws and the curses of those who will stray, Moses ends by encouraging the people. And you shall observe all the laws and statutes that I place before you today. Seemingly, Moses is saying that the blessing and curse is contingent on how well that we follow these laws. But which laws? Let's take a look at the next verse. These are the laws and statutes which I am giving to you in the land. And what follows are those laws listed one after the other, taking us from chapter 12 through chapter 26. And in chapter 27 is where we hear the rest of the details of the blessing and the cursing ceremony. So these blessings and curses, these episodes aren't really repetitions. They are bookends to a much larger story. Because we are so used to reading all of these parshas individually, we don't realize or recognize that this section of text spans 4 parshas, and it is actually meant to be read together. Now that we know all of this, let's do a quick recap on what we know so far about the book of Deuteronomy. We know that the book begins from Moshe's retrospective. We know that he is certainly is giving Israel a series of pep talks before they enter the land. The first chapter, the pep talks seem to come to a crescendo in chapter 11, where Moses makes a major promise to the people of Israel. Israel, this thing that you are about to do is of grave importance. You have before you blessings and curses. To achieve great blessings, to avoid the curses, you must follow these laws. So Deuteronomy is, just as we suspected, still a book of inspirational speeches meant to encourage the people before they enter the land. But it's also a book of law. Apparently, this massive list of laws was part of the inspirational speech. These are the laws Moses deemed so important, so essential to what it means to live in the blessings in the land, that he chose to emphasize these laws for the people. Now let's play a little game. Put yourself in Moshe's shoes. You've just pumped the people up, inspired them, and now you need to give over the laws that are the most important for them to know. Now you can't give them every law. That's impractical. So what are the laws that you would focus on? I don't know. Probably something like the 10 Commandments, right? I mean, those are pretty fundamental. Instead, though, we get these laws in Parsha Shoftim against moving boundary markers, rules of legal testimony, and cities of refuge. These are the laws that Moses wants to focus on, the laws that define us as a people. Really? These laws are so mundane and boring. Where are the 10 Commandments, or something inspiring? Let's go through some of these laws, and maybe we can see what Moshe had in mind. Don't move the boundary marker of your neighbor. Yeah, you always wanted a bigger backyard, but you just can't move the fence over a few feet and pretend that it wasn't there. That's dishonest. But it's more than dishonest. It's actually stealing. Now let's look at another law. One witness cannot testify alone against a man. We require at least 2 or 3 witnesses. If a witness with evil intent tries to bear false witness against him, the judges shall investigate the matter. And if they find out that he was lying, you must punish him. His sentence shall be whatever he sought to do to his fellow. Now, wait a second. Laws about testimony, laws about bearing false witness, laws about stealing, those are starting to sound a little bit like the 10 Commandments. Is that what's going on here? Are all of these laws somehow related to the 10 Commandments? Well, the 10 Commandments are the mission statement of the people of Israel. And I could see how those laws lead to blessings and also stave off curses. But maybe we're jumping the gun here. 2 laws do not a pattern make. Maybe it's just a coincidence. So let's see if we can find some more evidence for the theory that these laws somehow relate to the 10 Commandments. Moses tells the people to set up cities of refuge. Separate for yourselves 3 cities, and they shall be a place of refuge, a place where the rotzak, every murderer, shall flee. That word rotzak is straight out of the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 6, lo ritzak, thou shalt not murder. Commandment number 2 is, do not have any other gods before me. Do not worship avodah zarah. Well, if we look at the previous Parsha, at the beginning of this legal section, we hear, break their altars, destroy their monuments, burn their Asherah trees, and smash their idols. What's the best way to make sure there are no other gods before God? Get rid of the avodah zarah. Get rid of all the idolatry. It's remarkable, but the 10 Commandments seem to appear all over this legal section. And the question is, why? I mean, don't get me wrong, this is all very cool. It's awesome to realize that the blessings and curses are bookends. It's cool to zoom out of Deuteronomy and see the underlying structure of this book. It feels great to see hidden patterns within the Torah and see the 10 Commandments popping up. But the question is, why is this here? It can't just be here because it's cool. This structure, the fact that we argued that this is meant to be read as one story, that has to mean something. So what is the larger message? If Moshe is trying to teach the people the laws that define us as a people, there's a much, much easier way to do this. Why not just teach them the actual 10 Commandments? In fact, he will soon be teaching them in Parsha Vayiktan. He could have just said, hey, blessing to the folks who keep those and curses on those who stray from them. It's shorter and it's way more precise. For instance, in the example of the cities of refuge, I get that we are using the same word, rotzak, for murderer or killer. But a closer examination of this law will apparently reveal the opposite intent of the original command. The 10 Commandments say, do not murder. But the law in Shoftim says, murderers can flee to the special sanctuary city where they can escape punishment. And there are so many laws that we haven't even begun to explain how they fit or why they fit. So let's take a look at these laws and see if we can find any other reference to the 10 Commandments in these Parsha. And ask yourself, what is the larger story here? Again, let's take a moment and recap. We talked about how we are currently in the middle of a massive section of laws within the book of Deuteronomy. It's so big that it spans chapters 12 through 26 and more than 4 Parsha where we list law after law on seemingly random subjects. For example, in the next Parsha, we hear about the laws of the wayward and rebellious son, about how if you stumble upon a nest of eggs, you should shoo the mother bird away. We hear about the laws of returning lost objects, and the list of sexual acts that you should abstain from. These laws are similarly so fundamental that Moses says that following them determines whether we receive blessings in the land or we are destined with terrible curses. And the question again is, why these laws? Is there any rhyme or reason to them? Earlier in this teaching, we began to suggest that these laws aren't random at all. They are all somehow related to the Ten Commandments. But then again, why didn't Moses just keep this section brief? Why not just teach the Ten Commandments and call it a day? And in some cases, like the law of the cities of refuge, we are dealing with laws that seem to contradict the spirit of the original commandment. So, do not murder turns into granting sanctuary cities for murderers. And finally, while it is certainly very interesting that each of the many laws can be traced back to one of the Ten Commandments, and that this massive section of laws is meant to be read together, the question is, why? What is the larger message that this list of laws is coming to teach us? So let's continue. In our quest to understand how these laws fit together and tell us a larger story, I want to explore a few more individual laws in this Parsha and compare them against the original Ten Commandments. Do the laws align with the original commandments? Do they contradict? How do they play off of one another, and why? If we understand how these laws differ from the commandments, we might understand why Moses chose to teach these differences instead of opting to briefly list the commandments. Let's start with Ara Miklat, the law about creating cities of refuge. For whom? And these cities shall be a sanctuary, a place where every rotzak, every murderer, shall flee. As we said a few moments ago, the word rotzak, that's straight out of the Ten Commandments. Number 6, lo rotzak, you shall not murder. But it also contradicts the commandment. The commandment says, thou shalt not murder. And the laws we have here says, yeah, but if you do murder, you can run away as long as you get to home base before the justice tags you out. So what gives? Perhaps the Ten Commandments are telling us a larger picture to the do not murder. This law is giving us some principle, some nuance, that there are different types of murder and that they are not all treated the same. And let me show you what I mean. The Torah here says that not all murderers are eligible to flee to Ara Miklat. Only an inadvertent killer is allowed to flee to a city of refuge. Like one that goes into the woods with a friend and chops down wood. His hand goes forward to cut a tree, and the blade of his axe slips from the handle, hits his friend, and he dies. That death happened unintentionally. Now, on one hand, you could say that implies that he's innocent, that he did nothing wrong. But the text still uses the word rotzak. It still calls him a murderer. And while he is not punished like a murderer, he faces exile to a city of refuge. So what's going on here? We tend to look at the Torah's laws very rigidly, in black and white. It's either murder or it's not murder. But perhaps there's some nuance. Maybe it's not one or the other. Maybe there are degrees. And of course, the American legal system also has degrees. First-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter. It's where intent makes all the difference. If you lie in wait to kill someone, you are a murderer, and you are punished to death. If you kill somebody purely accidentally, the sages say that you are totally blameless, and a city of refuge is not for you. But consider the case of the inadvertent killer. He never intended to kill. He was merely reckless. It was reckless of him to chop wood so close to a friend. He ignored the standard safety regulations that require you to inspect your axe before using it. So he has some culpability here. But the punishment is temporary exile, not death. There are some shades of gray in the commandment not to kill. Let's take another example of law in the upcoming Parshas and see how it relates to the parent commandment. When you buy a new home, make a fence around your roof or balcony. let not there be any blood on your house, lest a man fall from your roof. What is that law doing in the Torah? It sounds like a building regulation passed by the local safety board. Moses says blessings will come to those who build their new homes up to a standard of code, and terrible curses will befall those who cut a few corners. Really? But if our eyes casually read over or skip this law, we may miss that this is too an expression of lo tezrak, do not murder. When the commandment says do not murder, it's not just talking about premeditated mafia hitmen here. It's a principle. It's a core value for the people of Israel. We are people who are deeply sensitive to human life. That sensitivity expresses itself in justice with intentional murderers, exile to the reckless manslaughters, and yes, it even has religious expression in our building codes. Build a roof or build a fence around your roof. Don't be negligent. Your actions will deeply impact others. So what we're starting to see here is that this section of laws is sort of an expression of or a commentary on the larger principle that is expressed within the Ten Commandments. And maybe that's what these laws are here to teach us. They show us how the larger principles that are the Ten Commandments express themselves in everyday life, sometimes with complexity and nuance. Let's take a look at a few other cases and see if this pattern continues. If we look at Parsha Re'ah, we are dealing with the beginning of this legal section. That Parsha contains laws about destroying foreign idols, not worshiping the gods in the way they are worshipped in Avodah Zarah, or worshiping foreign idols. Coming to serve God in his special place, including the Levite in our joyous sacrifices, the rules for how to eat meat, and pour the blood on the ground. We said those laws seemed so random and unrelated, but then we saw how they were all expressions of the commandment against worshiping foreign gods. No foreign gods. That's the second commandment. And indeed, that Parsha continues to detail the laws of the false prophet who encourages the people to worship foreign gods, or the family member who tries to convince you to worship foreign gods, or the city that is steeped in idol worship. But it's not just, oh, look, these laws aren't random. They all have to do with idolatry. No, these laws shed light on what the essential value of the second commandment is. The law against Bamat, building an altar in your backyard, and about sacrificing in God's special place, show us that the root of Avodah Zarah is selfishness and personal utility. The altar is not an appliance of convenience, a means for you to exert control over the uncertainty of life. Instead, the worship of God is about gratitude to the one Creator and to love. We go to his place not out of convenience, but out of a desire to build a relationship with him. So let's keep going. In chapter 15, we have laws about Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and of Eved Erir, this Hebrew servant. And these may be the easiest ones to connect to the Ten Commandments. In both cases, there's work for 6 years, and work ceases in the seventh. That is the Sabbath. We work for 6 days, but then we rest on the Sabbath. In fact, look at the language with Eved Erir. He should work for 6 years, and in the seventh, he should be sent free. He should stop working. And with the Sabbath, for 6 days, you should do all of your work. And the seventh day is a Sabbath to God, on which you will not do any work. The question is, of course, what's the connection between the idea of the Sabbath on one hand and the ideas of Shemitah or Ed Ivri on the other? The laws of the Sabbath are all about recognizing God as our master and creator. When you cease from work, from your own creative activity on the seventh day, as God did, you admit that God is the ultimate creator and our master. And just as there's a Sabbath in days, there's a Sabbath in years, where we abstain from the creativity of agriculture in reverence to God, our Creator. And after 7 years, we free our servants as a reminder that only God can be the master over a human being. But the connections don't stop there. Moses said that when the Hebrew servant goes free after 6 years, he should not be sent away empty-handed. The master should provide him liberally with flock and food. But why? Because you should remember that you were a slave too in Egypt, and God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you today to do this, to take care of your freed servant, like God took care of you. But these ideas in this language show up in reference to the Sabbath. Take a look at the very last line of the Sabbath commandment in Deuteronomy. And you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and God saved you with a powerful hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, God commands to make the Sabbath. The Sabbath, like the laws of kindness toward the Hebrew servant, demands some sort of memory of being a slave in Egypt. But why? For the Hebrew servant, the memory of Egypt functions as a call to empathy. Treat your servant kindly because you once suffered as a slave. Is empathy relevant to the memory of Egypt and is inspired by the Sabbath? Take a look at the words right after, "and you remember," in the commandment to keep the Sabbath. You and your children and your servants and your animals and the strangers in your gates, they should all rest just like you do on the Sabbath. Why? Because you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt. The Sabbath is also about empathy a master and creator has over those who work for him. In its most simple form, God rested on the seventh day to teach us to do the same, to teach us to not overcreate, to teach us to rest. But who needs that rest the most? Not the master, but those who are dependent on him, those who are worked by him. You were worked very hard in Egypt without reprieve. Therefore, grant reprieve to others. Your family members, workers, servants, even animals, like the plow-pulling oxen and the load-carrying donkeys. So the laws of the Hebrew servant aren't just an application of the Sabbath principle. They help give a shape and color to the multifaceted nature of the Sabbath. As the praise and worship team begins to come forward for our final song, we don't have time today to go through every law in this section, but all over we see this idea that the laws here are really pointing to the deeper values in the Ten Commandments. The commandment not to bear false witness, that's about honesty. We value a just legal system intent on reaching truth. And so you need safeguards, which we find here. You can't have just one witness. You need two in order to find truth. And you need judges and officers to set up a legal system. The mandate of a legal system is to pursue justice. Of course, it's about theft. God says, don't just avoid stealing. You must actively go out of your way to restore someone's lost property. The laws of sexual prohibitions in the Parsha, these two point to a deeper value. Do not betray sacred relationships. Just like the seventh commandment, lof tenaf, do not commit adultery. And the wayward and rebellious son, or sending away the mother bird, they show respect for the relationship between a parent and a child, just like the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother. So these laws aren't some boring hodgepodge, and the laws aren't a black and white list of do's and don'ts. Instead, this section of law clarifies the underlying values that define us as a people. The many laws show us that the original 10 commandments aren't just rules to follow. They are 10 foundational principles. They are 10 overarching values that express themselves in many shades of gray. They infuse spirituality and religious meaning in our building codes and when collecting eggs from a bird's nest. They teach us the sensitivity to human life and of the empathy that our Creator has for us and demands that we have for others. The Torah's laws are good, and they instruct us in deep sensitivity, and they are worth studying, and they are certainly worth keeping. If we stray from these values, if we don't become moral people, then we are obviously cursed. Any people that loses empathy, that are not just, will deteriorate into a cursed existence. And though it is through our deep morality, our clinging to the values, that we can build a society founded on justice and kindness. That society will be a blessing to those who build it and to those who partake of it. And maybe one day it will be a model to others. And to the people of Israel, they will finally fulfill their original mission statement given by Abraham to God. V'neh v'yikra decha kol mishpakot ha-adama. And by clinging to these values, through us, blessings will come to all the families of the earth. Amen and amen.